The real estate purchase and sale agreement, sometimes called the real estate contract, is a written document binding the owner of real estate to sell that property to the buyer, and similarly obligating the buyer to purchase the real estate from the seller. The real estate contract identifies the parties to the agreement, specifically the buyer and seller, sets out the proposed date for the closing, provides disclosures and warranties of the seller, and gives instruction in the event the contract is breached or cannot be performed. A standard residential real estate contract can be as short as a few pages, while a complex commercial real estate contract can be as long as 100 pages. Because these agreements are so complex and the details open to discussion, the process of negotiating the real estate contract can be daunting. While a buyer and seller are free, in the U.S., to negotiate their own real estate contract, it is more common for an agent representing each party to negotiate on behalf of their client. Real estate agents are trained and licensed to represent buyers and sellers. They're also more experienced in understanding the intricacies of the standard real estate contract and familiar with the local market standards and practices for real estate closings. The agent is therefore responsible to their client, the principal. The agent is obliged to advise the client of negotiating positions, offers from the other side, and what is best and reasonable to secure the principal's interest in the real estate contract. The agent has a fiduciary duty to present all offers to the principal, their client. This includes basic offers like the purchase price of the real estate, and small details like the furniture being left behind. The duty to present all offers includes unreasonable offers. If the seller wishes to list his real estate for sale at $300,000, but a prospective buyer submits a written offer for $100,000, the seller's agent is obligated to let the seller know about the offer and give him a chance to reject it. Why? There may be circumstances about which the agent is unaware that would cause the seller to accept even a low offer. In order for the real estate contract to be binding, there must be offer and acceptance. Acceptance establishes a meeting of the minds. A contract cannot be binding if both sides do not agree to all the terms in the contract, so that their minds have met as to everyone's obligations in the agreement. Often, we refer to the offerer and offeree. The offerer is the party making the offer, and the offeree is the party receiving the offer. Because these words sound alike and have little practical application, let's refer to the buyer and seller. Almost always, the offerer is the buyer. The seller has listed the real estate for sale on the market, and the buyer wishes to make an offer to purchase the real estate at or below the listed sale price. In a basic format, the proposed buyer would present an offer in the form of a complete real estate contract or in an offer sheet to the seller. The seller would then sign the offer sheet or contract establishing a meeting of the minds. But what if the seller disagrees with certain terms of the offer? Then the seller could reject the offer by presenting a written rejection, or allowing the time for acceptance to elapse. But if the seller thinks that he can get the buyer to agree to his terms, the seller can make a written counteroffer. The counteroffer is an offer in itself. A counteroffer is also a rejection of the first offer. A counteroffer does not create a contract with the buyer, until the buyer accepts the counteroffer. Again, offer and acceptance are required to form a contract. Whether it is an offer or counteroffer, there must be acceptance, and a meeting of the minds as to which offer is being accepted by both parties. In turn, the buyer receives and considers the counteroffer from the seller as an offer unto itself. The buyer can accept the counteroffer, reject the counteroffer, allow the counteroffer to expire, or make a counteroffer of his own. The cycle may continue numerous times until all of the terms are agreed to by both sides. The terms of the agreement must be exactly the same when both sides accept. Otherwise, there is no contract. There are numerous ways to make an offer. In many residential real estate transactions, an offer is made by sending a complete real estate contract to the seller. The offer will have an expiration date. Either the seller signs his agreement to the contract, makes a written counteroffer, rejects the offer, or allows the offer to expire. In other residential real estate transactions, and in most commercial real estate transactions, the offer is made by a letter of intent, or LOI. The letter of intent is essentially an agreement to make a contract. A letter of intent is usually drafted by the buyer's agent or attorney. It's offered after the basic terms of an agreement are negotiated by the buyer's and seller's agents over the phone, by email, or in a meeting. The letter of intent contains the basic terms of the agreement that will be put into a complete real estate contract. The terms include the names of the buyer and seller, the address and basic description of the real estate being sold, the purchase price, the proposed date of the closing, the name of the closing attorney or title company, the expected terms of the mortgage loan the buyer will take to purchase the property, basic warranties by the seller about the property and his ability to sell, and conditions precedent to the closing. Conditions precedent usually involves the condition of the real estate. The buyer may require the seller to pay off certain liens or clear certain title issues before the contract is signed. The buyer may require the seller to clean up an environmental problem or another defect on the property. Oftentimes, the seller will require the buyer to produce proof of sufficient funds or a loan commitment from an established lender to prove that the buyer can complete the transaction. Often, conditions precedent involves an inspection. The buyer will want to do a pre-inspection of the property to make sure it is suitable for their needs. Thereafter, the contract drafting may proceed. Generally, the letter of intent is not a binding contract in itself. Courts often say that an agreement to agree is not an agreement. This is because there is usually no consideration. During the letter of intent period, neither side has given up anything of value to obtain the other party's agreement to the letter of intent. Money does not usually change hands at this stage, nor is money placed in escrow. Further, the seller usually keeps the property listed on the market during the letter of intent period, so the seller has not given up any potential sales. The letter of intent will also list the time period allowed to draft the real estate contract. If the real estate contract has not been signed by the deadline, the entire agreement may be voided unless the parties agree to extend the time period. One example of how letter of intent and the real estate contract work together is from a recent transaction in suburban Atlanta. A community center was purchasing a commercial building that had been used for industrial purposes. The building required extensive renovation to convert it to the new use. Both parties understood this, and much of the agreement allowed for the property to be purchased as is. However, the buyer was concerned about the HVAC, or air conditioning and heating units, on the roof of the building. They were not adequate to cool the building, were old, and worn out. In fact, one of the units was leaking fluid into the building. Someone had to pay for new HVAC units. However, before writing the letter of intent, both parties agreed on a price. The buyer could not go up on the price because the mortgage lender would not approve of a higher loan. The seller could not go down on the price because he had to pay off an existing mortgage. The parties agreed that the seller would replace the HVAC units with specific instructions on the type of units to install, and he would take a tax deduction for the business expense, thereby allowing the contract to go forward. A letter of intent was drafted and signed with the provision that the seller replace the HVAC units as instructed. A real estate contract was drafted and signed by the parties, which included the provision that the seller had replaced the HVAC units with 4 new 20,000 BTU machines. Soon after the closing, the buyer encountered a problem during the renovation of the building. Specifically, there was not enough electricity for the building to operate. The problem was tracked back to the HVAC units that were sapping too much electricity. The new owner went up on the roof and found that the seller had not installed 4 20,000 BTU units, but rather 8 10,000 BTU units. The building could not handle the electrical load, and this was a violation of the letter of intent and the contract. The parties went to court. The seller argued that the letter of intent was not a binding contract, and the buyer accepted the building as is in the real estate contract. The buyer argued that replacement of the HVAC units as instructed was a material condition of the contract, and the letter of intent was binding because it was written in the contract. The court never got to rule on the issue. Like more than 90% of cases, this settled. The HVAC contractor admitted that he made a mistake in the installation and replaced the units and installed the correct units on the roof. When the real estate contract is prepared, it must be in writing. There is an ancient law called the Statute of Frauds that requires agreements for the transfer of real property to be in writing. In law school, many law students call this the Statute of Frauds. With that phrase, you'll never forget its meaning or importance. If an agreement to buy, sell, exchange, or encumber real estate is not in writing, then the contract may be void and it cannot be enforced in court. The reason for this is, exactly as the statute says, fraud. Real estate is very important and inherently valuable. The courts have reasoned, over the centuries, that no one would enter into an agreement to buy or sell real estate without writing it down. Therefore, if someone comes to the court with an agreement to purchase real estate that is not in writing, the courts will look upon this agreement with suspicion and usually rule it invalid. The potential buyer or seller could not get a court to order the transaction to go forward on an unwritten real estate contract, nor could either side claim monetary damages with an unwritten real estate contract. The letter of intent, once signed, leads to the drafting and eventual execution or signing of the real estate contract. The terms contained in the letter of intent are filled into the real estate contract, and the rest of the contract is drafted around them. There may be differences between the letter of intent and the real estate contract. However, it is likely that one of the parties will object and demand that the terms of the letter of intent govern and be placed into the contract. The real estate contract can be drafted by either the buyer's or seller's attorney. Local custom governs who does the drafting. Once the real estate contract is signed, that is a binding agreement that can be enforced in court. The real estate contract must be signed by both parties. Often, the real estate agents themselves also sign the real estate contract. Both parties must sign the real estate contract to show that both parties agree to the terms. Without a signature from one party, it must be assumed that the non-signing party did not agree to the terms.